Welcome to Season 2 of the Face to Face Ministries podcast. I am Melinda Wilson.
And I'm Cathy Little. Thank you so much for joining us as we introduce you to ministries and leaders from around the globe who have said yes to the Isaiah 61 mandate to heal the brokenhearted and set the captives free, helping people to step into who they were always meant to be.
And for more information about us, please visit our website, face2faceministries.org. That's all one word, no spaces, no numbers, and no caps. And please follow us on our social media platforms, face2faceministries.org on Facebook and on Instagram, face2facemin.
Welcome to today's episode. We are so happy you're here.
Welcome to the Face to Face Ministries podcast. We're so glad that you're here. We are very privileged, excited, and honored to introduce you to our next guest. We know that you will be greatly blessed, encouraged, and I'm just going to pass this over to Cathy, who's going to introduce our guest, but we're so honored you're here, and we're so honored our guest is here.
Yeah, so most of you, if you've listened to the podcast from the beginning, you've heard my story when I shared about how in 2008 I kind of had this major wipeout and incredible losses and lost my marriage, my church, and most of my friends, everything, my job, ministry. It was just a wipeout for me. And I really experienced an overload of grief at that time, even though there wasn't a death of a person involved, but there was a death of my life as I knew it. And in 2011, I stumbled across this book at the recommendation of a friend who had actually written a paper on it for a college course she was doing. And the book is called A Grace Disguised. And the subtitle is How the Soul Grows Through Loss. And the author of this book, his name is Dr. Jerry Sittser, and he has just retired as a professor at Whitworth University in Spokane, Washington. I actually read the book, wrote a song about some concepts in the book. The song was called Run East, and I did it at a conference and sent him the video of it. And he was so kind to respond, and we had a little exchange back in 2011. But as we've talked about having podcast guests and the different topics to address, one of the things that I think is really important in the conversation, and maybe even more so now today than it ever has been, is the topic of grief. Our friend here, Jerry, has walked an immense amount of grief and has also walked an immense amount of healing, and he has very articulately written this book about grief and about embracing the pain of grief because of the greater depth that it can carve in your heart. But we want to get right into this conversation, but I just want to welcome you, Dr. Jerry Sittser. He said I could call him Jerry. So Jerry, thank you. Thank you for saying yes and being part of this conversation. We're very honored.
Thank you, Cathy. The honor is all mine, actually.
Well, I just thank you for writing this book. I think I mentioned to you in our email that I've recommended it to countless people. And I always have the caveat that this is one of the best books on grief I've ever read. And so I would love for you to share your story. I want to start out there just to give some context and also to show everybody that you actually have authority to speak on the subject. So why don't you share a little bit about your story and a little bit about what preceded the book?
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, anybody who's gone through what I call irreversible loss has authority to speak on it, because there are so many different ways to face enormous loss. I'll circle back to that in just a minute. We moved to Spokane in 1989. I took a position as a professor at Whitworth University. My wife was a professional musician, and she directed a series of choirs here in Spokane. We had four children. The last was born just after arriving here, and she was also a homeschooler. My wife, Linda, was. And after completing a unit on Native American culture, we had a Christian professor at Whitworth that invited us to a powwow in Idaho. And so we drove down there and had dinner with the tribal leaders, had a lovely evening, and then attended the powwow. My two girls, Catherine and Dinah Jane, actually participated in the dancing. It was quite sweet. And I remember during the dinner talking with tribal leaders about the curse of alcohol in that particular tribe and how destructive it had been. Well, about 10 miles outside of the reservation, we were struck head on by a drunken driver. And it was such a huge blow that his car catapulted over ours. And he was going like 85 miles an hour and just missed a turn, plowed right into us.
Wow.
When the dust settled and I kind of recovered my senses enough to see what had happened, my mother, Grace, was seriously injured. She died. She was visiting us for the weekend, by the way, from another part of the state. And my wife, Linda, died, and my daughter, Diana Jane. I did mouth-to-mouth on Diana Jane. I tried to comfort and stroke Linda, but I could tell by the injuries she wasn't going to survive. And somebody else, actually, a stranger, got out of his car, and he went back, found my mother, and held her hand and rubbed her arm and comforted her until she died, which is an act of tremendous heroism in my mind, to be able to step into such a gruesome scene. The driver survived. His wife, then 9 months pregnant, died, so I consider that 2 more deaths. So it was a big, big event. 5 people killed in that accident. It took quite a while for the emergency vehicle to arrive, and we finally were all loaded on. My kids were beaten up and injured, but not terribly seriously. Same was true with me. My son, John, then only 2, was very seriously injured, but he's since recovered and is doing fine. So my 8-year-old, my 6-year-old, and my 2-year-old survived, and my 4-year-old was killed. Needless to say, that was a very big event in my life. It was like a bomb going off, and it took me quite a while to get back on my feet. I want to circle back to talk about the emergency vehicle at the proper time in this conversation too. Anyway, so that was the event. I spent the next 20 years trying to figure out how to raise my 3 surviving children, and built a life for us.
Wow. So when did the accident happen?
In 1991, so a long time ago.
Yeah.
For this interview, though, Cathy and Melinda, this gives me a chance to provide perspective.
Yeah.
It's been almost 30 years. And my kids and I observe the anniversary every year. We've done it now for 28 years. Wow. I write them letters, and we exchange phone calls and texts, and always memorialize. I think it's really important that we ritualize our losses so that they stay in play in the story of our lives without necessarily taking over and dominating the story. And ritualizing is one of the ways to do that. So I told my kids early on, we're never going to get over this, but we can grow into it and learn how to wear it, learn how to carry it with a little bit more grace and dignity and strength. And that has certainly happened. So, my kids are all now in their 30s, and they're married, they have children of their own, and we still remember and talk about and observe that accident and the consequences that it has played or brought about in our lives.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book an illustration about losing a tree in your yard, the favorite tree, and then that whole concept of re-landscaping. Why don't you share a little bit about that?
I appreciate that question a lot. I had several dreams or waking dreams or visions. I'm not even sure what to call them, but they were pretty significant spiritual experiences for me. And one of them was that. So in this particular vision or dream, I remember looking out the back window in our house. This isn't literally true, although we have a beautiful yard with lots of trees, but there was this big, big oak tree, huge, 100-year-old tree. And it had a bench under it, and we had picnics and swings. You get the idea. It was a major part of not simply our home and yard, but of our life. It was a metaphor for the kind of life we lived as a family. And the tree got a disease and eventually died and had to be cut down. So whenever I looked out the kitchen window into that backyard, I saw this gigantic empty space with nothing there anymore. And it just felt so overwhelmingly empty. It was a metaphor for how my life felt. And I didn't want to do anything. I just let it be. I just stared at it. But it occurred to me over time, rather than digging out the stump or grinding it down, let the stump remain and landscape around it so that old and new can exist together. So the stump remained, and then we planted shrubs and flowers and grass, and we reclaimed the yard without removing the stump. We let the stump become a metaphor for what we lost, but our planting was a metaphor for the new life we were going to claim and live out. And that really has been true in our lives. If you were to interview my kids, and they're really delightful Christian kids, they would talk about how rich our lives have been, even though they would also say with tears how hard it was to lose their sister and their mother and what they called their outdoor grandma.
Wow.
You know, I mentioned to you before we began this interview, we had our whole gang gathered for my 70th birthday. I've since remarried. I'll maybe get into that story too. And my wife Patricia's two daughters just happened to be really good friends with my two boys. Those friendships predated our relationship. And so they're married too. So the kids all spend time with each other, even apart from us. So we had everybody gathered together, 20 of us now. And then we had a really nice dinner with just the adults. And my three biological children gave me the gift of a weekend camping trip with just the four of us. Kind of for old time's sake, they said, let's do what we did all those years growing up together. Now that reverberates, doesn't it? That says something about how their experience has turned out.
Yeah.
And the kind of light they have in their eyes and the goodness that I see in the vital faith and the kind of parents they are, the kind of spouses they are. That's the advantage of looking back on 29 years, is that you have a history and you see the consequences of constantly turning toward God, even when all you can do is sit in silence or cry out of your heart, why have you forsaken me? Why have you done this to me? And that kind of thing. I look at any prayer is better than no prayer. Even if it's a really bad prayer. I'm not sure there are bad prayers, actually.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. We mentioned before the conversation got rolling here, before we hit record, the whole premise of the book is about how your soul can grow in the midst of loss. But we were talking about how this is really a now word, like what you are teaching, what you've said, what you've written. It has paramount importance right now, because we're talking about how, because of the virus and even you can add in the racial tensions and the violence and all different things that are going on, the world is absolutely traumatized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So why don't you just give some insight and perspective on the grief that is being experienced across the planet right now, and what, just kind of give some context, help people have language for what they're feeling, because I think a lot of people don't have a clue how to even tap into what they're feeling, or that they are indeed grieving losses, real losses. So why don't you address that topic for us?
Well, and multiple losses. I mean, the obvious loss we always think of is the death of a loved one. But there are many other kinds of losses besides that can have long-term consequences in our lives. Some of the more obvious of those less obvious losses, so to speak, would be, say, the end of a marriage or a wayward child. That can be tormenting for parents who wish their children would choose a different pathway in life and haven't. It could be a more silent loss, say a series of miscarriages. I met a woman years ago who had 8 straight miscarriages, 8 straight miscarriages. Finally had a baby when she was, I think she was maybe 38 years old. And that girl grew up to be a teenager and died of cancer at the age of 15.
Wow.
Now, I have no words for that. I don't even know how to wrap my mind around that loss. By the way, she's a lovely woman. She's really handled those losses with such grace and dignity. So there can be silent losses. There can be losses that have shame associated with them. In the case of COVID and everything, it has to do with isolation and loneliness and profound insecurity and uncertainty about the future. In many cases, we're going to see a spike in family dysfunction. I've talked to a lot of parents who said, my kids are driving me crazy. We are with each other all the time. I think, by the way, the respect for public education is going to go up significantly because people are going to realize I need school to get rid of my kids once in a while,
Pay the teachers more.
That's a really good idea, Melinda.
Yeah, wow.
Anyway, and in other words, there are less obvious losses that can be just as catastrophic and painful for people. Think about all the elderly people in nursing homes that can't have visitors anymore. Think about all the people who've lost loved ones, not to COVID, but to anything, and have a memorial service with 5 people. Think about all the weddings in these past months. I did a wedding and there were 5 people there and I was one of them, actually 6. My wife took photos.
Wow.
I mean, you have somebody who's 23 years old who's been dreaming for several years about the ideal wedding, and it's done.
Wow.
So you get the idea. There are all kinds of losses that are all tangled in this COVID crisis right now and in the insecurity of the economy and other things that is going to set off a process that is going to be years in unfolding.
Yeah, I've thought
And
that
it does take years too. In fact, I want to say right now, time doesn't heal anything.
No.
Yeah, you're
Time
right.
is the medium in which healing can take place. I have met people who 20 years after the event are bitter and resentful, who are literally collapsing in on themselves. You can see their soul just shrink to nothing.
Yeah.
And I've met other people after 20 years that are so full of grace and light, you feel like you're brushing close to heaven. Time didn't do that. It's the choices they made and the operation of the grace of God that did that, or the absence of the grace of God, depending on the kinds of choices they make.
Yeah, well, and I even teach on that when we're talking about trauma, that time doesn't heal wounds. It's a disservice to people. I'm just going to forget about it and time will go on, whether it's a relationship or a loss, a death of somebody, because of the brain science behind it, because the right brain, which stores all the experiences and memories and doesn't process time, which is why people experience PTSD. The car accident happened through the intersection of 12th and Main. And 40 years later, when I drive through 12th and Main, I start feeling the same feelings. Why is that? Because time doesn't heal wounds, because your brain sends you the message that, oh God, I'm back in the original experience because they haven't processed it. And that kind of leads me to a question I was thinking of for you. And, grief and trauma are obviously intrinsically linked.
They are.
I don't think you can have trauma without grief.
Yes.
Whatever the trauma is, again, the A trauma or B trauma, something bad happened to you or something that you didn't get. This is all includes grief.
Yeah.
And it really ties in with what we're doing, what we're passionate about, and that's about healing. But I want to talk about grief specifically in the context of some kind of loss where when people don't, and, I learned years ago, like in Psych 101, the stages of grief, and anger, denial, all of that, acceptance.
Which I really don't like very much.
I know, and I've heard.
Because it gives the impression I'm going to get over something.
Yeah, and it's like, I passed this one, and this one. Oh, I just have this one to go.
Yeah, I got an A. I passed all of them.
Why am I still feeling angry even though I did that 20 years ago? But I just would like to hear what you have to share about what happens to unprocessed grief. What happens to a person's spirit, soul, mind, body? And, I think that as healers, or as you as someone who's we can recognize this, but for others and even in ourselves, like how do we recognize or know when we have unprocessed grief?
Well, grief will always have its way with us one way or the other. It's undeniable and inescapable. It will chase us down. And if we don't turn to face it and let it have its way with us so that we grow through it, it will eventually consume us. One way or the other, it may deaden us so that we actually begin to lose our capacity for feeling or for love or for human emotion. I've seen that happen to many, many people. They literally just turn off. Mm-hmm. They become almost like spiritual and emotional zombies in a way. And that's a terrible loss.
Yeah.
For fear, because of the fear of pain, they deaden themselves not just to pain, but to everything. Mm-hmm. You know, I say this in my book that our nerve endings at the end of our fingertips communicate both pain and pleasure. The soul has a capacity for both sorrow and joy, for both tumult and peace, for both anger as well as forgiveness and love. And it's the same nerve endings that have a capacity for both things in our souls. So we have to recognize that this is simply how we're hardwired by the grace of God and by his creation. We've been made in his image. I mean, look at all the emotions that are ascribed to God in the Bible. Or look at Jesus, who's the human face of God.
Yeah.
He weeps. He's playful. He can joke. He can do all kinds of things because he's a human being. So if we don't turn to face it, it will have its way with us. We'll either deaden ourselves. Another alternative is to give ourselves to resentment. We keep playing the tape. We keep rehearsing the experience. We dig ourselves deeper and deeper into a hole. Unforgiveness can be that way, of others or of ourselves. Bitterness. There are so many ways that the soul can literally be destroyed through this. But in my book, and I think this is valid in the research, I make a distinction between primary and secondary emotions. Plato actually called primary emotions incendiary emotions. They're the things that happen immediately. Immediate reaction to something like anger, for example, or giddiness. If, you're 16 and somebody, the most unlikely person in the world, calls you up for a date, something like that. Secondary emotions are the ones that run deeper. They're the deep current. And those are more shaped by the choices that we make. They're not reactions. They're more habits of character that we develop. Resentment is that kind of thing. Bitterness is that kind of thing, so on and so forth.
Wow.
And if we don't do the business we need to do, those secondary emotions will destroy our souls. You've seen it happen. I've seen it happen. Mm-hmm. And God wants to do the kind of inner healing in us that we don't become a prisoner to those emotions. We're literally liberated from them. And we can move into deeper Christian emotions like joy, for example. I love this quote from Psalm 4. The psalmist is struggling with attitude in his people, kind of victimization and negativity. And he says at one point, "Thou hast put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound." Mm. In other words, joy comes from our relationship with God, not from a remarriage or striking it rich or something like that. Those kinds of emotions are too subject to the vagaries of time and chance. Deep emotion, the kind that God has given us the capacity for, can come in a vital relationship with him. And those are less subject to our circumstances. Thou hast put more joy in my heart than they have when they're living high on the hog, so to speak.
What would you say to someone who is afraid to, you talked about fear of being overwhelmed, and that's an obvious that it's like, oh God, no one wants to feel pain. I think we spend our lives running away from it, coping with it, doing whatever we can to avoid it, but it does catch up with us. But what would you say to someone who actually consciously is aware that they need to grieve, but I think there's a couple things here, Jerry, is that sometimes the Christian narrative is that we just need to rejoice in the Lord anyhow, or people quote scriptures at people when someone's died, especially, or give a I shouldn't feel sad about this. So what would you say to someone, especially those that know the Lord that are listening, have some grief, but are afraid to express it, either A, because they're afraid of what people will think they're not as Christian,
Yeah.
or they're afraid of being overwhelmed by it?
Well, the fear of being overwhelmed by it is a valid fear. That one I'm going to acknowledge right away. There are losses that are overwhelming losses, and traumas, as you pointed out, that can just be so unspeakably difficult that it feels like a tsunami. It feels like it's going to overtake our lives, and we will never recover from it. So I acknowledge that. People who have some mental health problems have even a more complex set of problems because they carry into their losses maybe an inclination toward anxiety or depression. And this just sets them off and can drive them deeper into a hole. In those cases, I say you need help. Find help. Small group, a friend, a therapist, a pastor. Make the circle of people involved very small. It needs to be small. In the end, I don't care how many people care about us. It's the 4 or 5 people that are going to carry us, and we in turn are going to be those 4 and 5 people for others as well. My experience was really public. My wife was a public figure in Spokane because of her musical career. I was pretty public. I had already published and did quite a bit of speaking. I taught a Sunday school class at a downtown church, and it had 400 people. You get the idea. And the event was such a big splash. 5 people killed. It was in newspapers all across the country. And I had everybody, it felt like there were a lot of voyeuristic people. And I had a lot of people wanted to become best friends overnight. And I made a self-conscious decision, 4 or 5 people. That's all the people I had time for to really share my deeper self. So I say to people who are afraid of that kind of tsunami of feeling, find help. They will stand as fixed points in your life. You might be overwhelmed. They won't be, and they'll carry you and hold you and pray for you and other things like that.
Yeah, I'll validate
that. When it comes to Christian performance, the idea of if I'm Christian, I'm supposed to be a certain kind of way. Just read one of the Gospels. That's all you need to do. Jesus, when he was entering the last week of his life, he went up on a hill overlooking Jerusalem and he wept with grief because he knew not only what was facing him, he knew what was facing that city and the history of those people and the losses that they would face in the future. Jesus wept. That is a mind-boggling thing to consider. Gnostics wanted to strip Jesus of his human qualities. Christians can never do that. Jesus Christ was God come as a human being, and he was a full human being. He didn't walk 6 inches above the ground. He somehow wasn't spared the struggles that we face. In fact, Hebrews says he was tempted in every way as we are, but without sinning. And that qualification of without sinning seems to give him the advantage. Nonsense. It's the opposite. As Oscar Wilde said, the easiest way to overcome temptation is just to yield to it. And Jesus never did. That means he had to live with that kind of pressure of temptation all the time. We just eat the second piece of chocolate cake and get so stuffed we never want to look at it again. We yield to temptation, and for at least a while we overcome it. Jesus never did that. Don't tell me he didn't know what it meant to be a human being.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's true.
But that's not talked about very much, Jerry. I mean, I think that we can get into he's so high and mighty out there, and, we're supposed to attain to perfection of Jesus Christ, and like, I could never be like Jesus. But when we study his humanness and his humanity, it's like brings things into perspective.
Yeah. In fact, there's a phrase that people will often say after they do something sinful and stupid. They'll say, I was just being human. No, you were being inhuman. The true human is Jesus Christ. The more we become like him, the more truly human we become.
Yeah, there you go.
He
That'll
is
preach.
the portrait of true
Yeah.
humanity.
Yes.
And Jesus wept. I still cry, probably weekly,
Mm.
over the loss of my loved ones. And that
Mm.
accident occurred 29 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to just one more question, and then Cathy can take over. I'm sorry, but that leads me into the
That's
question
okay.
of how do you know when you've grieved enough? When I say that with, no one can see me with, quote
Air
unquote,
quotes.
air quotes, but I'm fascinated that 29 years later, you still cry weekly. So is there a place where you come to the end of, okay, I'm done.
No,
I'm done grieving.
never. It changes, Melinda. You should never come to an end, to the end of it. We were made for these human emotions. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they should be comforted." He did not say, "Blessed are those who once mourned." He uses the present tense. Mourning should be a lifestyle for Christians. There's much to mourn about right now.
Yeah.
We should have lament as a part of our lifestyle.
Yeah.
Now it changes, right? It's not as deep, it's not as grievous, it's not as erosive to us. We also, if we're dealing properly with our own losses, we develop the capacity to carry the losses of other people. In other words, we expand, our soul expands.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We're able to grieve with other people and to weep with them. But we should never outgrow this. We should grow into it and learn to carry it differently over time. I have broader shoulders now than I did 28 years ago. And I'm able to enter into the story of other people. I still feel my own losses, but it's not debilitating to me.
Mm-hmm.
I've learned that my soul has a capacity to mourn and experience joy at the same time.
Mm.
It's not successive. It's not mourning, then joy. It's mourning and joy, not then, but and.
Mm.
Yeah, that commingling is almost, it doesn't seem like it could happen, but it does. I mean, even that old hymn, "Sorrow and Love Flow Mingled Down,"
Such a good hymn.
Yeah. And
Isaac Watts, I think, wrote that.
Great hymn. When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. Yeah. And you alluded to this about allowing grief to do what it's there to do, like in the whole concept of chasing the sun by just facing east and letting it come to you. I have shared that countless times with people, and that is the concept behind the song that I wrote. But that's something that was introduced to me by a friend who herself suffered a tremendous loss of husband injured and debilitated for 7 years, got a surgery that brought his life back, and then went into school to become a luthier, and 2 weeks into school hit and killed by a driver that was erratic. I mean, it's like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? But this is the woman who introduced me to your book through the concept of running east. And she's also a doula, so she's attended several births, and that whole concept of how a woman who's giving birth has a response to the pain. You can either try to back up away from what's going on, or you can lean into the purpose of pain. So I think I'd love for you to just address that concept of how is loss and this pain that I desperately want to avoid, anesthetize, ignore, whatever. How is it that I should embrace that? What does that look like? And why would I even want to embrace that pain? What does that look like?
Well, first of all, we need to be careful that we make a distinction between embrace and indulge. I've met people who have indulged.
Oh, that's good.
In pain. They almost enjoy it in a way. They gain a kind of strange and I think dangerous pleasure in their own victimization. And you can tell because the story they tell has no light in it at all. It is just pain, always pain. And another sign is that their pain seems to be worse than everybody else's.
Yeah.
Not different, but worse. We need to make a distinction between those two. I had a group of friends who encouraged me to write this book, and the first draft of A Grace Disguised was all theology. And they read it and said, insightful, great, it's so fresh. but you're not in it.
Yeah.
And it's not going to help people if you're not in it. And I wrote the second chapter, Whose Loss is Worse, to protect myself. I did not want the reader to think that because I had such a big experience, it was worse than anybody else's. It's not worse. It's just different. I haven't experienced the pain of rejection and divorce. I didn't have to deal with long-term terminal illness. I haven't had to deal with any wayward children. I mean, there are so many things I've been spared from. Now, do you want to trade your experience for mine? Probably not. The point is that they're all bad, just bad in different ways. So I want to be careful that we don't indulge in pain, but we do need to face it and embrace it. So as you're alluding to, I had another dream, and I was running west, frantically running west, chasing after a sun that was gradually moving toward the horizon. And I had a deep sense of panic in me because I didn't want to lose the sun. I wanted to stay within the sun and enjoy its rays. And of course, I wasn't fast enough, and the sun beat me to the horizon. And finally, I stopped and watched with a feeling of utter existential terror as the sun dipped below the horizon. And then I turned and looked east at the darkness sweeping over me and woke up.
Mm-hmm.
And in that moment, honest to God, in that moment, I thought I was going to live in darkness for the rest of my life. This was an existential experience for me.
Yeah.
I was so overwhelmed with the feeling of my loss and what I was going to do with those three traumatized kids. I mean, they witnessed the death of their own mother. I had to haul them out of the car over her dead body. And this is really hard stuff.
Yeah.
And that dream was a kind of metaphor for the darkness that I felt I would live in for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Well, my sister's a very close friend of mine, and I called her the next day and I relayed the dream to her. And she listened and she said, you know, Jerry, I have an insight for you. If you keep running west, you actually stay in the darkness longer. But if you turn east, even though it is overwhelming with its experience of darkness, all the sooner will you come to the sunrise. And that was the cue for me. I had to trust that there would be a sunrise. And I chose to turn east and plunge into the darkness. Well, then a cousin of mine told me maybe 2 or 3 months later of a John Donne poem. Donne was a 17th century metaphysical poet and an Anglican minister. He was the rector at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And he wrote a poem, and in the poem, he talks about the difference between east and west on a map and on a globe. On a map, east and west are farthest removed from each other. But on a globe, if you follow one or the other, they meet.
Yeah.
So those two interpretations gave me a cue. Don't be afraid of the darkness, as overwhelming as it is, because light is still there.
Wow.
And so I let the loss have its way with me. Now, I should qualify this. This might even sound a little conceited, but I've inherited sturdiness from my family system. My mother married very poorly. My dad was an absolute mess, but my mother was a very sturdy Christian woman. And she endured a very hard marriage and a horrible divorce and lived with grace and dignity her whole life. So I had some good schooling here, folks, and that did help me. And I've never had to deal much with mental health difficulties in my life. So I want to qualify. I'm not necessarily the ideal person here because I had an inheritance that did work to my advantage. Having said that, I went through a few really, really hard years. Really hard.
Yeah.
But I did not want to keep running away. This leads to another experience I want to relate to you, by the way. We had about an hour in the emergency vehicle between the scene of the accident and arriving at the hospital because we were in rural Idaho when the accident, or where the accident occurred. And so we were on the scene for about an hour, and then we were in the emergency vehicle for about an hour. And all four of us were together. And there were a couple of people. They had stabilized John at that point. And fortunately, those two emergency people did not say a word. They were smart enough to shut up. And even though my kids were whimpering and I was rubbing their backs and that kind of thing, I had an hour of silence. That must have been, it felt like 10 years. And I made all my major decisions in that 1 hour. And here's what I realized. I realized that something horrible had happened to us and that we would be marked for life. And I also realized that my kids would take most of their cues from me. And I wanted the bleeding to stop with this one experience because I realized, having had enough experience in life myself, that I could make choices that would keep the bleeding going, not just in our lifetime, but for generations. And I didn't want that. I literally said to God, the bleeding stops with me. I knew what unforgiveness would do to my children. I knew what resentment would do. I knew what physical indulgence would do. I knew what a quick remarriage would do. All of those things I felt would just bring destruction on them. And I said, this is bad enough. This is enough pain for a lifetime. I don't want to continue. And so I said to God, I'm drawing a line in the sand. The bleeding stops right here, right now.
Wow.
I think I scared God a little bit. I was so determined because I just knew what we had experienced, what we were facing ahead. And that was enough for me.
Yeah.
What was the first thing you did? Just even, I can't imagine, but having 3 little kids, you had to still go on, obviously, and give them food and clothe them. But how did you, what was in just practical everyday living, you had to attend to your own heart, but then you also had to attend to the needs of your kids. How did you do that?
Well, with difficulty, Melinda, but I will say this, I mentioned right at the beginning of this interview that I chose to try to ritualize things. That is to actually set aside time where I could give myself to this experience and not run away from it or be consistently avoidant, or on the other hand, grieve so much that it feels that would give the impression of my kids that they would never have firm ground to stand on. So I had to figure out how to do both of those things. I needed to be a consistent presence in the lives of my children. I wasn't perfect, obviously, but I also needed to give myself to this experience because it was a really, really traumatic one. And the memory never went away. I mean, I still look through the world. I look at the world through broken glass. That's never gone away. The noise has never gone away. It's just, I've learned to live with it over time and carry it with me. So my memory of that horrible experience has never receded. So I had to get up and get kids to school and make meals and coach soccer, and they were all musicians, so I had to get them to music practice and went to concerts and went to athletic events, and we did all kinds of we developed all kinds of fun little family rituals. Oh, every Sunday night, I'd put a tablecloth on the living room floor, and we'd have a, quote, picnic and watch an old Disney classic movie. Kids still tease me about that. They have the lyrics to the old animated version of Robin Hood absolutely mastered.
Wow.
We did a lot of musical theater. We went to musical theater. When they got older, I went to symphony concerts with them. I tried to create a rich life for them. But then after they were in bed, I would give myself time, and I would sit in a rocking chair in my living room, and I would just weep. I'd listen to music. I'm a classical music guy. I probably listened to Fauré's Requiem, 100 times. That was the music of my soul. And it touched me at the deepest places. I probably spent almost 2 years not being able to pray. I would pray in my silence. I didn't know what to say to God.
Yeah.
I was literally struck dumb. I didn't know what to say. I always went to worship on Sundays. For 5 years, when I went up, we do intinction, when I went up for the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, and I always bring my 3 kids with me, I would weep for 5 years every month. My little John, then 2, was literally permanently fixed to my side. I never went to a soccer practice. My older son played soccer, and he did too eventually. I never went to a practice without him being affixed to me. He never went to children's church, always stayed right at my side. If you ever heard of attachment theory,
Yes.
yeah. It's like when you look at all early photographs, he somehow got a hold of me. He just turned and grabbed. 2 years old. He just grabbed. Securest kid in the world, by the way.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, and part of that, Jerry, is you let him do that.
Yeah.
And I'm just thinking that was the healthiest, most life-giving thing that you could have done. And because I'm thinking some people would be, no, you need to go and grow up. But the fact that you let him be there with you, it was like, good on you, Dad, because attachment. You created that
you
secure,
should see. In fact, right now he called me this morning. He lives in Seattle. He took the ferry with his 2 little boys. Peter is 3 and Ace is almost 2. And he went to Whidbey Island on a big hike with the 3 of them. His wife, Annalise, is working today. How sweet is that?
Yeah. Wow. Well, Jerry, we are running out of time here. I know you have another appointment coming up in a few minutes. I just want to ask you this, just kind of a wrap-up question. Just acknowledging and validating the state of our world right now and the grief, the level of grief that people are experiencing, whether they're aware of it or not and may not have language for it. What would you want them to know? Those that are listening who are experiencing losses right now, they don't even have any box for what they're experiencing. What is the encouragement or advice or perspective you would like to offer to them as we wrap up here?
Well, I'm a church historian. That's how I make my living. I just published a book on early Christianity. And in one of the chapters, I tell the story of 2 massive plagues that swept through the Roman world, one in 165 AD and one in 250 AD. And maybe 1/5 of the population died in a few months period. So again, we're talking about a catastrophic kind of experience. And the Christian worldview proved to be highly persuasive to Romans because they saw the impact it had on the Christian church and Christian people, how they behaved, how they prayed, how they treated those who were sick, how they treated those who had died. And I can say only this: somehow in the mystery of it all, God is still with you. God is still at work. We live in a fallen world. God created us in his image, and that gave us a tremendous capacity to be very much like God or to be very much unlike God. I mean, this is the risk of having children. You give birth to people who are like you. They're not robots. They have their own free will. Children have a tremendous capacity to make parents very proud or to break their hearts. And that's exactly what God chose to do when he made us. He chose, in a sense, he took the risk to break his own heart. And we've done a lot of that. But in spite of the fallenness and brokenness of the world, God is still present. And he has the will and the power and the love and the light to redeem our losses. But we've got to turn to him. Even if the only thing we can do is be silent. Turn to him.
One more question on that, in that regard, Jerry. Can you think of a time in the first few years where you did have an experience of God meeting with you and knowing that he was there? Like not just the biblical
yes.
knowledge, but that
Oh,
experience?
yeah. One I can't share. It's just too deep. I just chose that is one I can never share. The other one I had another dream, and I was standing on a hillside looking down on a rural highway in Idaho. My 3 kids were standing with me, and they were all wrapped close. My arms were around them. And we were looking down, and we saw 2 cars approach each other. And it occurred to me in that moment, with this kind of, again, existential terror, one of the cars was ours. And we watched the accident. We watched it all. We were in the very car we were watching and saw all of the violence and all of the trauma. We heard the noise. The shattering of glass, everything. We saw it all. And then there was this great light that shone on it. It was the light of God. I knew it immediately. It was the light of God. The first thing that occurred to me is that the light only exposed how awful the trauma was. It was like blinding lights were turned on everything, just creating more color and exposing the violence for what it was. At the same time, I had this overwhelming sense that even in that experience, God was present. And I just knew God was in this. I didn't know how. I couldn't have explained it. And an explanation would have been too cheap. Mm-hmm. Here's where a theologian just has to shut up. They have nothing to say. I just knew that God was somehow mysteriously, powerfully, and redemptively present. And I knew in that waking dream, with the horror of that experience, I knew all would be well. Mm-hmm. I just knew.
Wow. Well, Jerry,
sorry for the emotion. It's just
no.
It's about 1 millimeter underneath the surface. My whole internal system was rewired.
Yeah. I get that. I understand that. I mean, we all have stuff, my story, it's like before and after, there's a before and after, and embracing what God wants to do in you through it, and believing that he's there with you, even in the darkest moment. And he is Emmanuel, God with us. Right. So, and what a beautiful way for him to show you, hey, in the midst of this, I can still redeem it. But man, I hope all of you guys who are listening to this have enjoyed this conversation, and not just enjoyed it, but gleaned some really powerful.
I'm not sure enjoy.
No, enjoy is not the right word, but
it's more of what have we.
That it's.
I think there needs to. There's a Selah, in the Bible when you're supposed to in the Psalms and make some.
Take a breath.
Yeah,
incredible. And I felt like there needs to be not a mic drop as much as a. Let's just sit with this for a minute. I know what you're talking about, Cathy. I mean, it's so rich. I think there's so much here to digest. And, for me, I'm being very vulnerable right now. I'm feeling teary about my own loss, that I know that you're right. 30 years later, I still feel it's like, so I get it. And I think that you've given freedom to people to feel, and especially as Christians who were afraid of that, but to feel, to experience, and to know that it doesn't mean that we're less than, doesn't mean that we're less mature. It doesn't mean that we're
human,
broken and wounded in this, mess. It means that we're human.
Yeah.
And that we're becoming more and more like him. Yeah. So thank you for giving people permission to feel and experience their grief. And I know it could be another 2-hour conversation.
Yeah. And I did ask you before we started that we may have to come back and further the conversation. And I would love to do that.
And thank you. It's been a privilege. And you are 2 very lovely people. So I wish you well.
Well, I'm sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, I love him. I mean, you have had so much, your fingerprints are on my journey, even though we have just met now. Your fingerprints were very much a part of my journey through grief. And I highly, highly, highly recommend to anybody listening right now, please go grab a copy of A Grace Disguised by Dr. Jerry Sittser. And I am telling you, it's Sittser, Jerry Sittser. And you said there's actually the potential of a 25th anniversary edition coming out with some extra resources in it.
We'll see.
We'll see. Because I'm thinking, the world needs this. The world needs this. So thank you for your investment in my life and your investment in so many countless lives that have been impacted positively by your journey. And thanks for your vulnerability and sharing that, and for your willingness and your time today. We really are so honored, Jerry. Thank you.
And it wouldn't have happened unless you had been willing to walk through your own, to face east, to run east, and to face the darkness. And so thank you for your bravery, because without your courage and bravery, you couldn't have written the book.
And now, since we've had this conversation, I may very well tag into the podcast the song I wrote, because it was directly from your influence. I actually did record that formally on an album after my journey back to life. So I know you've got to go to another call. Thank you. And we'll be in touch for sure.
Yeah, bless you and your work.
Journey, and the journey isn't easy. And we're all broken. We're all in need of God's mercy.
Thank you for listening to the Face to Face Ministries podcast. And to be sure not to miss any future episodes, please subscribe.
And to help us get the word out, please share this podcast with your friends. Give us a 5-star rating and leave us a brief review. More content is coming your way.
Thank you so much for listening.